Hi, and welcome to the OT is In, the podcast where we merge the worlds of education and occupational therapy to empower families like yours. I'm Sarah Collins, your host, an occupational therapist and a homeschooling parent. I've experienced occupational therapy by supporting families for over 15 years, but also through seeking out support of my own children, so I'm right here in the trenches with you. Though there is not one way to educate your child, there is a lot to consider when individualizing an education. And the goal of this podcast is to explain some of the why behind what an occupational therapist is thinking so you can apply it to your own family. Especially with my three favorite topics: executive functioning, handwriting, and sensory processing. Each episode will be packed with practical tips, expert interviews, and real-life stories aimed at helping you to create a supportive learning environment for your child. So, grab your headphones and get ready to dive in of the collision of education and occupational therapy. I'm Sarah Collins from Homeschool OT, and I'm thrilled to have you with me on this journey of discovery. Hey, and welcome back to the latest episode of the OT is In podcast. Today we have a special guest, Hana Eichele. Hana and myself, Sarah Collins, your host, go way back to when we both started our occupational therapy businesses. While we bonded over our shared experiences, Hana has carved out a unique and specialized niche in the world of OT, focusing on pediatric feeding. In this episode, Hana shares her journey into the specialized field of feeding therapy. She breaks down the complexities of pediatric feeding disorders, also known as PFD, and offers valuable insights into the development of oral motor skills, fine motor skills, and the social aspects of mealtime. Have you ever wondered what signs to look out for if your child might need feeding support? Hana dives deep into developmental milestones and when it might be time to seek that additional help, because we all know that homeschooling is not alone schooling. So listen in as we discuss the dynamics of feeding relationships, practical tips for parents, and how to manage the stress that often accompanies feeding challenges. So whether you're a homeschooling parent struggling with mealtimes or someone interested in learning more about pediatric feeding, this episode is packed with essential information and resources that you do not want to miss. So stay tuned as Hana provides practical strategies, resources, and compassionate perspective that can help make mealtimes more manageable and enjoyable for everyone. Hey, and welcome back to the OT is In. Today I have a friend with me, Hana Eichele, who actually we met several years ago when we were starting our OT businesses around the same time and went through lots of information on the best practices within OT. And Hana, though we got along really well, is in a totally different side of this world of OT than me. So here she is to talk some with us about feeding and eating and the world of oral motor skills, fine motor skills, development of foods, enjoyment of foods, meal times, all the things. Hana, can you tell us first a little bit about who you are and where you are?
Sure. Hi, Sarah. I'm so glad we got to connect again. It made my whole day when I saw your name come through to talk about the podcast. So very happy to be here. Yeah, we did start our businesses around the same time. I have my private practice, Roots Pediatric Therapy. We have an office in Gilbert, Arizona, and then we also offer virtual telehealth services right now just to Arizona families, but possibly to families in other states.
Great. And tell me, how did you get into specializing in feeding?
Yeah, so I feel like the long and short of it is that I was always interested in feeding and eating, but I didn't even really know that feeding existed as a specialty outside of eating disorders. I always knew what eating disorders were, and in undergrad, I did some volunteer stuff in that world. And then when I got to grad school, I learned more about feeding disorders, and I'm like, oh, this is amazing. I can put it all together, more the rehab side of OT and being able to look at all these other factors, fine motor and gross motor, these other skills, and put it together with the psychosocial component. And so that's how I really got into the world of pediatric feeding disorders.
So just for those who are listening and new to what on earth is OT. So when we define occupation, it's one of the ways that you occupy your time. And obviously eating and being together at mealtime are both, that's an occupation in itself. But that pulls in what you were saying about the fine motor skills and all these underlying pieces of the actual eating, and also that social component of being engaged in a mealtime with others. So, Hannah, when we are speaking about the development of this, let's talk about what would families be looking at to say what should be happening, and then when it isn't, what does that mean?
Yes. Oh, there's so many things to that.
Yeah.
First of all, I do
Unpack
have to
it.
say that occupation is so confusing, and I am forever grateful that now that I'm in the feeding world, when people say, "What do you do?" I literally can just say, "I help people learn to eat." And no
I
one
know,
ever
right?
is confused
Yeah,
by
no one's,
that.
what is that? What's your elevator speech? What is occupation?
Yeah, no, it's just, it's really great to be able to do that. And then from there, I learned what I actually do is I do teach kids how to eat, but I really also help parents learn how to feed. And so that's
Mm.
where there's these two elements, and why feeding is so different is because feeding is always done in a relationship. So there's dynamics with it. And so
Yeah.
it's, yes, a child does need to learn how to use a bottle or breastfeed, and then they do need to learn how to move their tongue and how to chew all of these textures of food. But the parent also needs to know how to feed them. When do
Mhm.
I feed my kid? How do I feed my kid? What do I need to feed my kid? What does this look like for my family when my sister-in-law does it this way, or my neighbor does
Yeah.
it that way, or my parents did it this way, and maybe this way is not your way. And so it's really looking at all of these different areas and to figure out what is feeding and what is this relationship. And if it's not going well, why is that? And so that's really why, like, when I started Roots, the whole point was like, we need to get to the root of the problem. And so if a kid isn't doing what we think they're supposed to do, is it because our expectations are wrong or off, or just not based in reality of what a
Mhm.
child could be doing at a certain age? Or is it truly that we've tried everything and our child really just does need support from an occupational therapist or someone that can look deeper at those skills of, oh, they can't pick up the spoon, or they're throwing the spoon because they literally cannot put their hand around the end of the spoon.
Right.
And maybe they need a different type of spoon or a different type of utensil. So there's a lot to it, but that's the overall picture.
One of the things that you mentioned there is you're like, I need to evaluate what's going on within the person of why can you hold the spoon? Can you put it to your mouth? But you're also talking about the environment there.
Mhm.
And this is one thing that I talk about a lot within homeschool OT, because we're speaking primarily to, obviously, to homeschool families who are all, there's not two homeschools that are the same. I would assume that you would say the same thing, that there are not two meal times the same. So there clearly is not one right way, only one right way to do something. Am I right?
100%. Yes, I would say you're absolutely right. And I, at this point, have not homeschooled my daughter because she's a toddler, but I've been at home with her and set up
Mhm.
different things. And I think one thing that's really frustrating for parents is, even if they think they figured out what works well within their own home, meal to meal can be different. So
Yeah.
it's just similar to a child where it's like, yes, I've mastered sleep and we know the exact routine and we like to rock and then we read 3 books and then we shush and pat and roll off the bed onto the hallway, not speaking from experience. It's like, but then the next day doesn't work because they had a
Yeah.
developmental. Yeah, it's really, I think, the missing piece. And like a lot of things, even if you were to Google, like, why won't my kid eat, or things like that, what we're missing is that we need to tune into what's actually happening and learn trust. And I think that is probably huge in homeschool too. Like, you need to
Mhm.
trust yourself that you can educate your child. You absolutely can.
Yep.
There's no reason you can't, but you have this whole identity crisis. And it's almost the same thing with your kids of, like, you need to trust that what you're doing is okay and that it's working for your family. And so if that does not look like 3 meals and 2 snacks a day and every 2.25 hours, then I'm not doing it right and I'm wrong. And parents take it so personally. And
Yeah.
it's just, we need to step back and trust ourselves, and more so trust our kids. And the way we do that is look at their cues. So we actually tune in to what are they telling us. I know a lot of people, my kid won't sit at the table. Okay, let's tune into the cues of why they aren't. Recently, I've had a kid who is now all of a sudden overstuffing and starting to make uncomfortable gagging noises at the table. And he wasn't doing that for a year. We found out that he has a new game. And so he was wanting to rush into his room after the meal. And so it wasn't that he didn't know how to eat these foods. It was that his environment changed. And so like,
Right.
by knowing and tuning into it, it's like he was rushing and overstuffing his mouth, but I knew why, because of what was happening after the meal. So that's why.
So it sounds like you ask a lot of questions of what's happening before, what's happening during, and what's happening after to try to get down to the underlying why of what's going on. Am I right?
100%. You are right on that.
Love it. So what are questions or specific observations? So if parents are trying to figure out the why, is there like a specific list of questions that go through your head or some tips that we can tell parents to get started with this?
Yeah, definitely. I think just knowing, first of all, the biggest thing is if the parent has a concern that something's wrong, it's okay to seek out more answers. So often parents, I call it like a bouncy ball. It's just like this bouncy ball. I don't know. Do we need help? Is this normal? Is this typical? And then the bouncy ball is just going for a year, 2 years. It's totally fine if you feel that something is off. It might be like you're not an expert. Maybe you are if you're in this field at knowing how they should be chewing and what foods they should be chewing at what age. So it's okay if you need to get help. So I think just knowing the first thing first is just that if you have concerns, there might be a concern and it's okay to get more help. We can talk specifically about how to refer and how to connect to, but just knowing that like parental concern is something that you can tune into and say, you know what? Yeah, if chewing's not right, let's see if we could figure out why that is. That would be one.
That is so important because another thing that I say frequently is that homeschooling is not alone schooling. And that's because there are so many people that are out to support us that we do not need to be experts in everything, but we do need to know when and how to find the right people to support our teams and to be empowered that we are in charge of our teams, right? Like you are the leader because you are the expert in your child, but you can pair the expertise in your child with the expertise of someone else to support your kiddo and what they need and want to do.
Yes.
You mentioned, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say one other kind of tangible thing with that too is parents knowing if something's keeping you up at night, it might be something you need to look into. So I think just if this is an issue where every night when you go to bed, you're thinking about it and wondering, then it's time to seek help.
Yeah. So when you mentioned chewing, talk about that a little bit more, because what would somebody say, wait, chewing isn't right? How would you know that?
So let's back up a little bit, and I'm going to tell you about something called pediatric feeding disorder. So I know you're aware of this, but for parents who might not be, in 2021, there was a landmark diagnosis that came out, and it was pediatric feeding disorder, or PFD. And the reason this matters is because when kids won't eat, there's always a reason. So it's more than picky eating. And so with PFD, there's 4 different areas or domains. And so that is how we really figure out where the issue is. And then I'll tell you where chewing lands. So there's medical, nutrition, feeding skill, and psychosocial. So before
we go on, is there a good resource for that we can put in the show notes?
Yes, feedingmatters.org is an amazing nonprofit started over a decade ago by parents in Arizona and is now an international organization and is absolutely incredible with the research, education, everything. So feedingmatters.org. They have a questionnaire on there I was going to mention later. If you have a question, if your child does need help, they have a questionnaire you can actually complete 0 to 36 months old for your child, and it will send it right to the doctor, or you can print it and bring it in. But they have resources, how to find people, what is PFD, all of that. So yes, feedingmatters.org is like the #1 resource in this area.
I love that. You guys, as an occupational therapist and a fellow homeschool mom, I know how vital it is to meet kids where they are, especially when it comes to learning math. And parents, I hear your concerns about gaps in your child's math education. The fear is real, but it doesn't have to hold you back. So CTC Math, which is the program that we use, is designed with mastery and progress and tracking built right in. So mastery means that your child won't just move on because the lesson is over, but they'll keep practicing until they truly understand each concept. They can do this by taking more questions online or by printing out worksheets to actually handwrite the answers. And they'll keep practicing. You can clearly see what your child knows and where they need support. No more guesswork, no more gaps. The curriculum is provided so that you can trust that nothing is missed. But here's the best part. You still have the privilege of supporting your child's specific needs. Now, as an OT, I love finding ways to make math more accessible and to come right alongside my kiddos. Recently, we just had to turn notebook paper sideways so the lines became instant column guides. This helped him to keep his math problems neat and aligned. So sometimes a small tweak can make a world of difference. And again, you still have the privilege of working beside your children as much as they need it. Now, in addition, the short self-paced lessons reduce that overwhelm and they do encourage independence. Perfect for kids with all different learning needs. So confidence will grow, gaps will close, and you'll have that peace of mind. So visit CTC Math to try it today because every child deserves a strong foundation. Welcome back. So let's pick back up with what are those 4 quadrants that kind of feed in to PFD.
Yeah, so the 4 quadrants are medical, nutrition, feeding skill, and psychosocial. And that gives us a framework to know how many people truly work on this. There are a lot of different professionals. So obviously we're occupational therapists and we work in the feeding skill domain, but there's obviously overlap. So we're also medical professionals. So we would look at the medical background, we would look at the nutrition background. Are there growth concerns? Do they have specific nutrient deficiencies? And even into the psychosocial. OT, most people don't know, started out as a mental health profession, and we are very holistic. So we understand relationships and parent-child dynamics and mental health concerns. So we also dip into there. But within the feeding skill, it really is mostly just occupational therapy practitioners or speech language pathologists. And then within that, we can actually have someone come directly to us. So in some states, we don't even need the pediatrician, and a parent can just say, hey, you work on this feeding thing, do we need help? And then we have various questionnaires. We go through an eval process, just like any other type of therapy you would be starting. And then we can help plug you in. Hey, I really think you should see a dietitian, or, okay, now let's get definitely the pediatrician on board, or, hey, I think we should do a GI consult. Like your kid is not doing their schoolwork because they have a stomach ache a lot and are spending a lot of time in the bathroom. And so they're not able to focus on their schoolwork. That's a big one of just looking at like the different areas. And then with chewing is a few different things. The biggest one is that by 36 months of age, kids have basically developed their chewing skills. So they can eat almost anything that an adult eats with a few modifications. There are a few choking hazards up until at least age 4, like popcorn, hard candies, round things, even some different crunchy chips and things like that. We definitely want to be monitoring and aware, and obviously eating or alongside our kids or sitting next to them. But really, like between up until that point, they are learning how to do certain things. So I always say a big shift, like around 6 months of age is when a kid's going to start learning how to eat, and whether a parent wants to start with just purees or they want to do some self-feeding, also known as baby-led weaning, all of it is fine. And then really they need time. So like for 3 months, they're really exploring in the sensory aspect and that. And then 9 to 12 months, they're getting a lot more independent already, like being able to pick up little pieces of food. And then around 12 months of age, they're often shifting mostly into being able to rely on solid intake. And so they're reducing that milk intake a lot, whether that's breastfeeding or bottle feeding. And then from there, really from like 12 to 18 months, you're seeing a really big shift in how their tongue and lips and jaw all work together. So you should be seeing a lot better actual chewing motions. The tongue ends up doing things like a broom would do, where it's sweeping foods, it's going side to side, it's sweeping it all together, and then allowing someone to swallow it. So you're seeing a pretty quick advancement through those foods, and you might still see some gagging and things like that. But during those big stages, like 6 to 9 months, 9 to 12, and then now all of a sudden, even like 12 to 18 months, like you should feel like you're going forward. And if
Mhm.
not, then it might be something to look at. Okay, this happens a lot where they'll call us and the kid's 12 months old and they still have yet to barely even accept a puree, even though they've had lots of practice and lots
Options.
of opportunity. And then same with like after a year, it's okay, they're still not really advancing. Then that's where we're looking at like how much milk are they having? Are they full on milk? Then they might not be
Yep.
interested versus no, we've tried it. We've done different times. We've offered things that are salty and crunchy and soft, and we've had them in the high chair and we've had them in the stroller, whether I'm supposed to or not, that kind of thing. And they're just like, I don't know what to do. So definitely those ages. And even within that time frame, a lot of kids can also have mastered an open cup and a straw too, even by some by 12 months, but mostly by 18 months. So then the next big one is 2 years old. Like they're doing a lot by then. They're able to follow more cues. They can participate in mealtime a lot more. They can be using utensils. They can use their open cup. They could use a straw. They could be eating all these different food groups. Some kids that we've worked with are only still exclusively on breast milk by 18 months or 24 months. And so then that's when obviously the parents like, okay, they need to learn how to eat, because there are
Mhm.
certain windows that make it easier to learn how to do things. And so we don't really want to wait till they're 2 and then now we're trying to play catch up and they're at a 6 month
Right.
level.
So there's a few things that you mentioned in there. One of them was that you're starting to pick up foods and whatever, which to pick up foods have to be laid on your tray or made available to for you. And I totally recognize that there are lots of sometimes it's hard where it's a lot easier for us as parents to just feed and I got to get somebody to basketball practice and this kiddo somewhere else, right? And so we're just trying to like make meal times go faster. There's also it's so much mess to clean up. What do you say to those parents that really struggle in the time and or mess area?
What I say is mess before manners.
Oh,
We
I
like
love
to.
that.
However, that does not help with the parents' issue of being able to quote unquote tolerate mess. And so
Yeah.
I think that's where they really just pick one thing. So I had this sweet mom and she had worked so hard for our child was 9 months old and she was trying to do 8 different things a day. Do the certain things with the chairs and the utensils and all these different foods and following 3 online programs. No. If you feel stressed out by what you're
Yeah.
thinking is going to make it better, you need to pause like that. No, too much work. So then I was
Yeah.
like, how about something red one day? Pick a color. And then because she knew all these things, but she just needed someone to say, it's actually fine to just do a little less at a time.
Yeah.
For mess, it can be outside of mealtime. If you
Hmm.
are mowing the lawn or you're raking the leaves, let your kid jump in the leaves. Let your 6 month old roll around in the grass.
Yeah.
That can be a way to get sensory experiences. It
Just
doesn't
don't run them over with a
always,
lawnmower, please.
please don't do that, or get the rake too close. But yeah, it doesn't always
Right.
have to be like plopping a thing of yogurt on a high chair. However, that can
Okay.
be really fun and funny too. But if you're not at that stage, like there are ways outside of meal times to get there. And then also realizing, you know what, in my family, we call it capacity. So
Mhm.
what do you have capacity for? So if during the week you're both working and homeschool is taking a lot of time and energy and effort, then maybe the weekend. So then every
Mhm.
Saturday, we let our kids make a huge mess. And then if you want to do it inside, then put it on a towel or
Yeah.
put down. They have different things now, like a catchy on the high chair. Amazing.
Feel like I might
I'm
need to
not
link to
sponsored
that
or
because I don't know
anything,
what
but
that is.
just an example, like my husband and I are like, why didn't you do this sooner? You don't have to bend all the way to the floor to pick up
Yeah.
food. It attaches to a high chair and catches the food. So
People are
things
so
like that,
smart.
like there are things that you can use, but really tuning into your own capacity so that when you are doing something, you're not resentful and bitter and like
Yep.
forceful, because you're like, oh, I'd let you get messy every single day and you're not dealing with your own stress. Is, you know what? I know this is really important. And so I'm going to find a way to fit it in my week when I have the
Mhm.
capacity. And
I
so
love
that's
that.
okay if that is
And
less.
we've had episodes in the past on co regulation, and we're talking about that we as parents, even within the homeschool. We say connection before curriculum, but it very much is, if we are stressed out by the mess, then our children are going to feel and know that their bodies are going to react to us during that meal time. And so even if you are allowing them to have to make their mess or whatever at that point, it's still not the positive experience. So I love when you're saying, when is it? If it's not now, that's okay. Admit
Yes.
it and say that's
Yes.
okay and advocate for yourself. But when is it, right? So when do you
Yes.
have the capacity for that? I love that.
And you made a really good comment right there that I want to call out of connection before curriculum.
Mhm.
That is amazing because I always say connection before correction. So
Okay.
yeah, when we're doing something is you always want to focus on the connection. And so absolutely, if you're doing things that are overextending, it's going to get in the way of connection, which is what really matters at the end of the day. So it's not about the broccoli, it's about how the mealtime went and the overall health of a person, which is social and spiritual
Mhm.
and emotional
Mhm.
and physical, and we know that. And so there's a lot more to it that I think people really discount. And so knowing at the end of the day, you know what, if this allowed my kid to connect, I'm going to do it. And that might be making a mess and
Yeah.
letting them learn how to crack eggs or not, and that's okay
Mhm.
too.
And we are going to have a whole episode on nutrition. But I do want to acknowledge how stressful meal times can be
Mhm.
when our kiddos are not eating or are have this diagnosis of PFD. So when we have this diagnosis, what are some ways that we can connect? What are some tips that you can give parents so that we're not continuously bringing more stress?
It's a really good point to make because often what I say, and it does get a little more serious now, but it's like people dealing with PFD are under similar stress to those that are like going through chemo for cancer. Like I've worked with
Wow.
families that like the amount of time, effort, energy,
Mhm.
resources that they're putting into just allowing their child to be nourished is significant,
Right.
and the research supports that. And so it is a lot. And so most
Mhm.
of the time, like you are going to have less opportunity in a season. So I'm like, if you're really working on feeding, you might not be in swim lessons for the spring,
Yeah.
or you might
Mhm.
have to opt out of something because it really is that stressful. And really, people are alone. They feel alone
Yeah.
with it. And so I think that just like first being like, people will even say, let's say they find the Feeding Matters website or even talk to me and realize that PFD exists. They're like, I
Yeah.
cannot believe it. I've been struggling all this time and there's millions of other people out there. And just recognizing you're not alone. One
Mhm.
in 37 children under the age of 5 are estimated to have PFDs. If you're
Really?
thinking about that
Wow.
number compared to other diagnoses, it's a lot. And even
Yeah.
up to 80% of kids that have developmental disabilities. So
Wow.
basically, and yeah, most people at some point do deal with it. So I think connecting outside of mealtime is really where people improve. Of it's okay if meals we're not dancing and singing and doing mealtime cards or whatever.
Mhm.
Like mealtimes do include pouches and mealtimes
Mhm.
do include me giving my kid the same exact thing every morning. Great. Guess how many people
Mhm.
eat the same thing every morning?
Yeah. Mhm.
They make their coffee the same way and they eat their oatmeal
Mhm.
with the same topping. So it is
Mhm.
totally fine and great if your child wants predictability in a chaotic world and wants to eat their butter toast every morning. But maybe you can help them learn how to do it themselves. Like there are just other ways to connect. And I think knowing that, and if you can get to a point where you're working with the right professionals and you spend less time on food, you realize that there is more to life than food and
Mhm.
eating in mealtime.
So I think that's a beautiful thing. One of the things that you've mentioned is finding the right professionals. And I know that there's lots of different types of programs. Can you just dive in a little bit to what some of those options are as far as feeding therapists?
Yes, definitely. So I would say the first thing is like using Feeding Matters and looking and seeing who's in your area. But then the second thing, if your child is under 3 years old, there's early intervention programs, and those are free in all 50 states if you're in the US. Typing in online early intervention program, they will do a comprehensive assessment, and you do have to have a certain level of challenges to be able
Mhm.
to qualify, but it would at least get you started with talking to someone. Sometimes talking to the pediatrician, not all of them are aware. They're like, oh, you're growing, it's okay. So not all of them really understand the depth of it, but even just mentioning, hey, I learned about this pediatric feeding disorder. Have you heard of it? And then engaging, and then they're like, oh yeah. And they might have an OT or an SP in the area. And then another way is to go on the health insurance websites. So most people don't know this, but most people want to use insurance. And so going on to their insurance website, so so-and-so insurancecompany.com, it's find a doctor. Even though it says doctor, you can type in an occupational therapist. And then from there, you can look for someone. And then really Google Maps is a way too, especially because sometimes with feeding, you end up needing weekly services, things like that. And so just even typing in therapy near me, feeding therapy near me, any place, pediatric place that offers speech therapy or OT might have someone that does offer feeding therapy, can be helpful too.
And you practice what we call responsive feeding, correct? But there's also other types of programs. So when not all feeding therapy is the same, right? So what are some differences there?
First of all, if someone says they practice the gold standard or the best out there, that's not totally factual because of the research in the feeding field. So almost all studies out there are case designs just on one child. So from there, you really do need to narrow down the type of provider. So there's different like feeding approaches that people might hear about and look up. But two like major camps for those would be a more behavioral based approach versus a responsive feeding approach. So you can even look up responsive feeding therapist or responsive feeding therapy, that kind of thing, and then try to see if you can find someone. And within that's back to way in the beginning of the conversation about cues and really not forcing, taking the pressure off, that kind of thing, and really helping children learn how to eat versus getting them to eat. We let them eat. One of my favorite SLPs says that. Versus behavioral based approach is we need to eat X number of bites and we have to eat these bites and we are going to put this slice of turkey and we're going to do whatever it takes in order to eat that. And then for people who end up really needing it, there are children's hospitals that have multidisciplinary programs as well. If someone does end up needing a feeding tube or they just need more support, they can even look at their children's hospital in the area. There's sadly really only about 16 of those, but in each region there are at least some resources available.
That was one of my very first experiences with occupational therapy as a whole. Was I worked at Children's Hospital in Richmond, Virginia, and I was a recreation therapist at that time, but they had a feeding program there, and I met there was OTs and SLPs working in there, and I was like, this is very interesting.
And actually that reminded me, I can't believe I didn't mention it. Like a lot of families that are already getting therapy, ask your therapist.
Yeah,
I've had so many times where a lot of our referrals come from other therapists because the families, they keep talking about it. Like I had a 17-year-old and she's had feeding issues for easily 13 years and had never seen a feeding therapist. And the SLP she worked with was not one who specialized in feeding. And she's like, it's taking 3 hours a meal. I don't think that's right. And so she was able to spot it. So yeah, if you have a current therapy team or friend or something, ask in your area.
So smart. Hannah, thank you so much. And what are some ways that people can find you and your resources? Because I know that there's awesome things out there.
Yeah, they can check my website anytime, which is rootspediatrictherapy.com. And then I pop in and out of Instagram at roots.pediatricfeeding or the.mealtime.maven. So yeah, that's where I have some resources. I've been a co-author on a couple of books as well.
I was going to say, and you have books. Hello.
Beyond a Bite, found on Amazon or anywhere books are sold. Beyond a Bite, Parent Edition. It's like less than $20. It's really helpful to get even more of this background info. Or there's also
it's one of the resources that I recommend frequently, very frequently to families who, as you're going through your homeschool day, eating and feeding, meal times are a big struggle. And I almost always recommend Beyond a Bite to go along with that. It's so good.
Thank you. That's a mantra your guests can take with them is we got to go beyond a bite and figure out what's going on and why, and that we're never, ever alone because there are a lot of people out there that are willing and able to help.
So good. Thank you so much for being here.
Bye, Sarah.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the OT is In podcast. I hope our discussion has provided valuable insights and support for your homeschooling journey. Remember, as homeschooling parents, it's essential to address our children's diverse learning and developmental needs. So if you're seeking personalized guidance, Homeschool OT does offer concierge services tailored to your family's unique requirements. So these services can provide practical strategies and heartfelt encouragement to empower your homeschool experience. To learn more about how Homeschool OT can support you, visit the services page at homeschoolot.com. Explore the resources available and discover how my expertise can enhance your homeschooling journey. In essence, how we can partner together. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to having you with us on the next episode of The OT is In.